Welcome to Stat Masters, where we teach you how to use Player Profiler to win at fantasy football and better evaluate players. My name is Aaron Stewart, and I'm a senior analyst for Player Profiler, and my co-host is Chris Bonagura, a Fantasy Intelligence Network analyst for Player Profiler. Chris, who are we talking about today?
I was thinking we should break down some number two receivers, or let's call them receivers who currently hold the number two role in their offense and have very expensive prices in fantasy football right now. Players like Jaylen Waddle, DeVonta Smith, T. Higgins, and Christian Kirk, all playing across from very talented players, but they themselves are very talented players. So I think it would be fun to break them down and get an idea of just how talented these guys are and what we can expect from them while playing across from a talented player, and then what may happen if that talented player weren't on the field. So I want to start with Waddle. He's the most expensive one, and personally, I think the most talented one. He's currently wide receiver 11 on Underdog, and I think you would find him in the top 15 ADP across pretty much all sites. Any initial thoughts on Waddle?
With Jaylen Waddle, it took me a little bit to fully buy into him, but after his past season, I'm all in, all the way in on Jaylen Waddle.
Why didn't you like him? What were your skepticisms before?
For last season in particular, it was the thing that everyone was worried about. Tyreek Hill's there. Oh no, Jaylen Waddle, who is super productive slot receiver. But what's he going to do when there's target competition? Turns out he can be even better in fantasy football. So Jaylen Waddle playing a completely different role where he was primarily a slot receiver as a rookie, running deep routes. His second season improved his not his ADP. He improved his points per game last season. Second straight year of being a top 15 wide receiver and doing that alongside an elite guy like Tyreek Hill and doing it in different ways. I'm all in on him. I look at his average depth of target. As a rookie, number 88, 6.3 yards per target. His second season with Tyreek Hill jumps all the way up. It doubles to 12.1, number 33. So he wins short, he wins medium, he wins deep routes now. And it doesn't matter what the system is. Doesn't matter what his role is. All he does is score fantasy points. So if you're going to take a wide receiver 2 in fantasy, Jaylen Waddle's one I'm A-okay with. Even though wide receiver 11 seems super high in fantasy football, the way he started last season was absurd. He kind of cooled off a little bit due to injuries, but he can certainly return value at his ADP.
Yeah, he did miss week 11 and then was a little worse for a few weeks. Had a couple down weeks in 13 and 14, and even with that, finished as the wide receiver 12. Plus, the last couple of weeks, both players suffered from poor quarterback play. And there are pretty significant splits of what they were able to put up with and without Tua. One of the most striking things for me with Waddle is how similar he is to Tyreek Hill. Now, there's never going to be another Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill is truly special. His quickness and speed, really a player that fast in the short range, the long range, and that talented at wide receiver, kind of a once in a lifetime guy. But everyone always likes to compare players to Tyreek Hill. Kadarius Toney, Marquise Brown coming in, this and that. They're the next Tyreek Hill. Jaylen Waddle is the closest thing we're really going to see. Doesn't have the short area quickness. No one really does. But Tyreek Hill is 5'10", 185 and ran a 4.34. Jaylen Waddle is 5'9", 180 and ran a 4.37. A little smaller, but basically just as fast, long speed-wise, and basically the same size. And we saw last year on the field, these guys were interchangeable. If you saw a play down the field that went to a receiver, you didn't know if it was Hill or Waddle until you had a clear shot at their number or at the player. They literally looked the same playing-wise. Now, again, Tyreek Hill's obviously faster. Like you said, Aaron, he gains the increased target competition and turns into a better player. Earns less targets, of course, but still earns enough targets and that 21% target share that you love to see. Kills it on yards after the catch, starts earning more deep targets. Would like to see a higher average depth of target, but that's also kind of a symptom of the offense and how they played. There were also a few whiffs between him and Tua, and also with Hill. They definitely missed on a couple of easy, deep passes on that team last year. Yards after the catch was great. Receiving yards was great. Every metric, just killing it. Yards per reception, yards per target, number 1. Yards per route run, number 4. You really just can't do any better. Number 3 in EPA. Just a truly elite guy. And I think the one guy on this list, and we'll look at the other guys, but the one guy that we can truly call an alpha receiver, I think outside of the top 4 or 5 receivers, right? Outside of your Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, maybe a Stephon Diggs and an A.J. Brown and like a Lamb. Once you get past these 7 guys, and Adams if he were in his prime, I don't think there's anyone else in the league right now that you put him across from Waddle, and Waddle's not the 1A, and the other guy becomes the 1B. Certainly the other guys on this list would be a 1B to Waddle's 1A, especially because now we've seen, like you said, 2 different types of player. In his rookie season, we saw a higher target share, higher target, lower depth of target guy who played in the short area and just absorbed targets when no one else was there. And then when he got the Juju Smith-Schuster effect of you can now play a bigger role because defensive coverages are focusing on the quote-unquote alpha, on his Antonio Brown, which is Tyreek Hill, he also crushed that. So he did it with and without Hill. There's really no questions here. You have to just take him. Of course, you would always love a player to be cheaper, but he does go after any player you could name that has definitively more talent. And he does slip sometimes to the late second. He's a very nice player. I don't really think you have to go too far into it. I don't think anyone's hating on Waddle at this point. The next guy would be DeVonta Smith, who, another player that I love, but I have a touch of skepticism with Smith in regards to his cost. And that's a new revelation for me. He's one of my highest owned players. I currently have him at about 20% ownership through 51 Best Ball Mania 4s. So certainly a guy I've drafted happily. But I'm looking at him, at his profile, at what the Eagles did last year, and at value over replacement to other players. 207 points on underdog last year. Doesn't necessarily scream to me a guy that's a 250 to 300 point guy. He might just be one of those 190 to 210 point guys, and we have a lot of those. DK Metcalf is one of those. You scroll down a little further, right? Mike Williams, technically, when he's healthy, is one of those. Terry flirts in that range, right? DJ Moore when he's healthy, or Christian Kirk now is one of these guys. Brandon Ayuk. So it's not a matter of is DeVonta Smith good or bad. It's is he good enough to overcome the value over replacement as a second round pick. Now he does fall into the 3rd round now sometimes. In the 3rd round, great pick. Size doesn't matter anymore. We already know he's overcome that in the NFL. Speed doesn't really matter. It was picked 10th overall. Great player. 2 years now, similar to Waddle. Same exact argument. We saw a lot of nice in the first year, and then he got to play across from A.J. Brown and did better, earned more targets, better receiving yards, worse yards per reception, but that's just a stat that fluctuates sometimes like that. It's not a huge drop-off. It's a yard difference. Good air yards, good. The receiving touchdowns could be better, but smaller guys are never going to necessarily crush the red zone. Jumps from 36 to number 14 in points per game. Earn a 27% target share across from Brown. 136 targets. Average target distance could have been a little nicer, but wasn't off the board. 22 deep targets. Number 7 in yards after the catch. Yards per reception, yards per target could have been better, but those aren't necessarily sticky stats. Yards per route run was really nice. I mean, by all means, this is a top tier wide receiver, one of the best in the league, a top 15 player in football at the position. I have a bit of skepticism. Aaron, am I wrong? Can you convince me that he's just worth the cost that I've been buying him this whole time? And it's not a case of the Eagles had a very high statistical performance last year, and if they even slightly regress back to the league median, his scoring is not going to necessarily warrant that 2nd round price tag.
I'm with you with the skepticism on DeVonta Smith, and I really, really like DeVonta Smith, especially last season. You talked about some of the things he did really well. He's a yards after the catch guy. He does well on yards per route run, top 10 and expected in EPA. number 12 in QB rating per target. Like, he is a great receiver. These are the advanced metrics that point to it. There's even room for improvement. I like the last row on Player Profiler for wide receivers. We look at his win rate versus man. It's wide receiver 36, kind of pedestrian, right? For one of the top receivers in terms of ADP and in terms of points per game, because he's wide receiver 27 in target rate versus man. The way I interpret that is I go, there's room for improvement that can help him return value at ADP, but it's not certain. I mean, everything went right for DeVonta Smith last season. The Eagles were an offensive juggernaut, and that helped DeVonta Smith. The other reason why DeVonta Smith can be just fine in 2023 is, like, I think it's going to be a more consolidated offense. There's a lot of unknown behind DeVonta Smith, behind A.J. Brown. We don't really know who the wide receiver 3 is. It's open competition. You have the incumbent Quez Watkins. They brought in Olamide Zaccheaus. I can't tell you right now who the wide receiver 3 ends up being on this team here. And that does favor DeVonta Smith. Maybe DeVonta Smith gets 1% more added to his target share to help him maintain the points per game that he scored last season.
Well, I mean, I actually think it's pretty clear cut. I think A.J. Brown's the 1A, Smith's the 1B, and then the wide receiver 3 position is then just split among Brown and Smith. They're just the 1, the 2, and the 3. Because I agree, it's going to be hyper consolidated. I think it almost edges Goddard out a little bit more. He's obviously a great player and he'll be efficient with what he gets, but you have to be worried about Goddard's overall volume because so much of it is going to these two guys. DeVonta Smith right behind Jaylen Waddle in incredibly talented player. Other players get relegated behind them. The only concern here for Waddle compared to Smith is I genuinely think Waddle could finish as a top 5 wide receiver, even with Tyreek Hill there, and definitely with him not there. Smith does have that top 8 in him, but you would need A.J. Brown to not be there. I don't think he does it with him there. And like you said, a lot went right. The problem isn't necessarily Waddle. Again, it's the value over replacement for Smith. Waddle scored 221 fantasy points last year on less targets. Smith, with the 207, and that could be more of a ceiling, where for Waddle, I don't think it's quite at a ceiling. And then when you look at who you have to draft him over, it's hard to take DeVonta Smith as opposed to a Tony Pollard, right, or a Ramondre Stevenson or a Nick Chubb when he falls, when these guys could be very impact difference-making running backs. When DeVonta Smith's going to be very, very good, but not necessarily difference-making at receiver when there's so many guys that can probably match his scoring that are behind him. So it's really just a price thing. Again, one of my most drafted receivers up to this point. I adore DeVonta Smith, but I'm starting now to pump the brakes. And my current 20% exposure, I want it to be more like 12% by the time I draft my next 100 Best Ball Mania 4s.
And that's the correct move right there. It's the fact that DeVonta Smith was wide receiver 14 in points per game in PPR leagues. An underdog is half PPR. We saw DeVonta Smith had 95 receptions, right? And if that's his ceiling, you're not getting any value at wide receiver 13. It's not a complete avoid, right? Like we've put what the cases are for him to return that value there, but that involves another major step up there. And that might not be the case for DeVonta Smith. Like, he was really good. He was really efficient, very productive. It's hard. Like, I'm having to really dig deep in the advanced stats, the analytics, to go, this is where he can improve to take maybe that next step up. It's hard.
Yeah.
You still draft them.
Players don't always get better. And even if he just matches what he did last year, which would again be incredible, it's not worth the pick. His stat line from last year isn't worth a late second round pick. It has to be better. And it might not be. Now, his stat line from last year, you can still win a tournament and win a fantasy league and win money taking him in the second round, but to a degree, you're setting yourself a little back off the gate, where I want as much upside with every pick. Now, in 150 picks, entries, of course you take him 10 to 20 times, because if he's the one that does it in week 17, it didn't matter where you drafted him. But it's an overall symptom of wide receiver pricing right now. and it's not DeVonta Smith's fault. But someone who it is his fault is T. Higgins. I don't have much love for T. Higgins, Aaron. How much room is in your heart for T. Higgins?
Oh my God. With T. Higgins, where with DeVonta Smith, we were okay with, but starting to fade. Higgins' ADP doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Wide receiver 14 right now, an underdog. Overall, like tail end of the second round. And I'm sorry, if you start your draft with the 101 and you take Christian McCaffrey, you can't take T. Higgins to be your wide receiver 1 on your best ball team. You just can't. Higgins, unlike the other two guys that we talked about, like Waddle and DeVonta Smith can take any pass to the house. They were yards after catch machines. They're route runners. They have speed. Higgins was number 26 in yards after catch. He was outside the top 20 in yards per route run and formation adjusted yards per route run. Number 19 in expected points added. It's not bad, but like that's not wide receiver 14. He was number 7 in QB rating per target. Like Joe Burrow is going to continue to throw the ball to him, but like it's the Joe Burrow effect that pushes him to wide receiver 14. His points per game last season, he dealt with some injuries. He played through it, but he was wide receiver 26 in points per game. In 2021, that was the big breakout year, wide receiver 12. His rookie season, I know a lot of times rookie seasons we will forgive, but it was wide receiver 38. Like we have 3 seasons of T. Higgins. We know exactly what he is. He is a like low end wide receiver 2 with some spike weeks that probably push him to maybe being a mid wide receiver 2 at best. The ADP is saying, no, this is a high-end wide receiver 2, and those guys that you take at wide receiver 14 right outside being a wide receiver 1 in fantasy have to have the upside of Jaylen Waddle, of being elite at his craft. T. Higgins does not have that. He's a fine beta receiver. Jamar Chase is the alpha, but T. Higgins isn't anywhere close. And the most damning stat with him, his target share has never topped 24%. In his entire career, each season, he's outside the top 20 at his position. Target share is important. Simple analysis there, but like you have to be super efficient to finish outside the top 20 in target share and be an elite top tier wide receiver 2. That's not T. Higgins. You draft T. Higgins, you're just donating your money to Underdog.
Yeah, and before people, unsubscribe from the platform and burn player profile at the stake for what we're saying, T. Higgins is a very good player. Not arguing that. Where Jaylen Waddle and DeVonta Smith, we argue that they aren't necessarily at their ceilings. I think we can see a much higher ceiling from Waddle, and I think we can still see a slightly higher ceiling from Smith. But I think with Smith, his floor and ceiling are essentially the same. As long as he's not hurt, he's always going to produce similar to what he did last year. I think Jaylen Waddle, we can see a lot more. T. Higgins is at his absolute ceiling as wide receiver 14. You called him a low-end wide receiver 2, Aaron. I think that's a little damning. He's a high-end wide receiver 2, but you're correct in that he's limited. And the problem here, similar with Smith and to a degree Waddle, is the value over replacement and the overall symptom of wide receiver pricing right now on Underdog. It going a little too far in this range when you have really good running backs in the same range and arguably really good quarterbacks now with the top 3 guys falling to the 2-3 turn. Now, when I see T. Higgins, I'm seeing a slightly, ever so slightly lesser version of Mike Evans, which is a massive compliment. Mike Evans has had one of the best football careers of any player ever. It never gets talked about. This guy has been incredibly impressive. If you drafted him as a rookie in Dynasty, you were unbelievably happy. Just 1,000 yards every season, always 14 yards per reception, good air yards, touchdown spikes. Targets, though, there was the 2016. There were the higher years. But this is a guy who flirted with a target range of 110 to 130 with, spikes. His fantasy football finishes. Now, he had those nice wide receiver 1 seasons, but he always was back-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2. And the thing with Mike Evans, because of the limitations to his game, never being a yak guy, but doing everything else really well, is not just a contested catch receiver, a sick route runner, and a good contested catch receiver, but could find open space, just didn't generate the yak. And the yak is what gets you from these numbers to Antonio Brown's numbers of always being wide receiver 1. T. Higgins, if you just look at the counting stats, he's gearing up for similar. I think you can argue, because he only played 14 games in 2021 and he was slightly banged up last year, that 110 targets is not his target ceiling. It's probably like Mike Evans. It's probably 130. When we look back at his career, he'll probably have 150 target season. And certainly there's something to be said that as a rookie, he was a rookie. And then the last 2 seasons, he had to play alongside Jamar Chase. That certainly will hinder your counting stats. But you remove Jamar Chase, and I don't think the stats get any better than these stats, and these stats were great. It's a compliment, but it's to say that wide receiver 12 to wide receiver 26 in points per game is probably his ceiling floor range, with a few career years in that top 8. Also similar to a guy like Marvin Jones. Marvin Jones was like that for years. And with Mike Evans, we discussed this on a show a few weeks ago, his ADP and his value were always correlated. The years where he was too expensive, last year, Mike Evans was a second-round pick. He was a terrible second-round pick. He wasn't even bad last year. Mike Evans last year was a terrible second-round pick, and he scored 186 fantasy points. That's 20 less points than DeVonta Smith, and he was a bust in the second round. Now, he's a 6th-round pick. I'll draft him again. 3 years ago, he was a 4th-round pick. So similar to Mike Evans, this show every year is just going to be based on T. Higgins' cost. If T. Higgins is a 4th-round pick next year, I'm drafting him. He's a 2nd-round pick right now. I don't really want to draft him. I will take him here and there. He's the type of player that you can never draft 0 because he is good. He is tethered to Burrow. And again, there's if Chase goes down and T. Higgins is the guy in the final week who does it, you needed him. There's also the Chase, Burrow, Higgins stacks that are very obtainable, where you take Chase in the 1st round, Higgins in the 2nd or 3rd, and Burrow on the way back in the 4th. But that's pretty much it. And you really hit it on the head, Aaron. It's the target shares. DeVonta Smith and Jaylen Waddle earned over 20% target shares despite playing across from A.J. Brown and Tyreek Hill. Having talent across from you is not a reason not to earn 20% target share. T. Higgins, 18.6% this year, 23.9% last year, 2 years ago, but Chase was a rookie. And then 19.1% as a rookie. It's not that he's ceding targets to Chase. He's ceding targets to Tyler Boyd. That's bad. The ADOTs or whatever, yards after catch are bad. And the efficiency, like Aaron said, it's good. It's not bad. This is not an untalented player, but it's not, hey, let me draft you at the 2-3 turn good. So I'm definitely see Higgins as much more of a wide receiver 2 or like a sub alpha if he were a team's 1. But he's also a guy that is capable of 40-point spike weeks. So he's always going to be on the radar. It is just new Mike Evans. And when we look back at T. Higgins' full career, his stat sheet is going to look the same as Mike Evans. 1,000-yard seasons, but never quite was the guy. And then our last one, certainly not least, would be Christian Kirk, who Nate Liss famously coined about 6 weeks ago as the next Tyler Lockett, as in to say, the guy that has proven himself to be a very good receiver, not a top 10 receiver, but very good, and will pretty much always be underpriced. And will always just be that one pick in the 5th or 6th round of your drafts where you're like, oh yeah, I took Tyler Lockett there, and he paid off as my wide receiver 2, as my wide receiver 3. Was never your wide receiver 1. You look at Christian Kirk, the size, the speed is fine. He has draft capital. The reason he gets a little bit more hate is because he was a 4th-year breakout. And these things happen. Not everyone is a first 3-year breakout. But now, I think we've seen in the last 2 years his floor-ceiling combo. It's a ceiling of wide receiver 18 and a floor of wide receiver 30, and he'll pretty much always be priced somewhere in that range. This is a 100 to 130 target type player who will flirt with 1,000 yards most seasons, gets good air yards. He'll be 5 to 8 touchdowns. I mean, this is just who he is. I don't think the presence of Calvin Ridley keeps him from scoring these points this year. He's not going to do better, but he's probably not going to do worse. And Ridley can also get his. Both players can eat. 23% target share, 133 targets. He has yards after the catch. It's number 15. He's not elite, but it's certainly better than most. It's better than T. Higgins. 9.4 average depth of target isn't amazing, but I can live with 9.4. And his EPA was good, number 31. Good, not great. You at least want to see him around that top 30 because a lot of players fall outside of that top 30 for EPA. And efficiency, nothing really jumps off the page, but not the type of player where you would really see these metrics. And if you go back through Christian Kirk's career, a lot of these metrics oscillate, and you can find a season where he was top 10 or top 15 in any of these metrics. It's just, 1 year he was really good at yards per route run. The next year he just crushed yards per target, and it kind of fluctuates. You're kind of just looking at a perennial wide receiver too, who actually right now is starting to approach a cost where I don't want him as much, but he was a late 5th to even early 6th round pick for a while. He's now approaching the 4th round. He's a 4-5 turn type player. I believe he goes around 48. I don't know why I'm not seeing him. Here we go. Christian Kirk, wide receiver 27, ADP of 48. He's priced appropriately among receivers. He's a touch expensive among all players. There's a few running backs in that area I'd probably prefer. But again, it's a symptom of wide receiver on underdog right now. The top 40 are all a little too pricey. You kind of just have to live with it. But among receivers, he's right there, closer to his floor.
Let's start with the very first thing. Oh, Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley is on this team, and Calvin Ridley is going to take over being the number 1 receiver. Is it Ridley? Is it Kirk? Is it Kirk? Is it Ridley? It doesn't matter. There's just one stat you need to see on Christian Kirk's profile, and it's on that first row for opportunity. Slot snaps. 494 slot snaps, number 3. Calvin Ridley hasn't had that amount of slot snaps in his entire career. The most he's had in a season is 121. I mentioned that of going, they can coexist together in a Trevor Lawrence-led offense. They can. Ridley is not going to come in and take much of Christian Kirk's workload. They will be great together. And with Christian Kirk too, you also mentioned the ADP. Wide receiver 27. Overall, that's 48.5. And the last 2 seasons in points per game for PPR. Last year, wide receiver 18. He was the alpha. The year before, where he was in Arizona, there was Hopkins. There was, I think, the corpse of Larry Fitzgerald. He was wide receiver 30. Wide receivers 27 is right in the middle of those two. You're not reaching to draft Christian Kirk. We've seen him produce as an alpha. We've seen him produce just fine as a secondary option behind Hopkins. He's going to be just fine in Jacksonville. The price is appropriate. Top 15 in targets, receptions, receiving yards. We mentioned the slot snaps. Ridley's not taking that role from him. Number 15 in dominator rating. I expect that, of course, to go down because Calvin Ridley, that's a pretty big addition to an offense. You're not usually finding wide receivers that were that dominant the prior season at that ADP. Christian Kirk, he's Tyler Lockett. Calvin Ridley's DK Metcalf. That's how you started it. It's just new Tyler Lockett. And Tyler Lockett, for years, just continue to score points. Christian Kirk, I know round 4 sounds expensive, but he can return value. Trevor Lawrence is legit. Trevor Lawrence getting ready for that ascension. It started in that playoff game against the Chargers. That is the game we will look back and go, this was the start of Trevor Lawrence's legacy. Going to lead into this season. Kirk is going to be a great wide receiver 2 to target in your best ball drafts. He will be fine. He could even outproduce Calvin Ridley. It's a coin flip. You go on Twitter, people having debates about it. Doesn't matter who's right or who's wrong on that one. Christian Kirk will return value.
Just like Metcalf and Lockett for years, especially last year. They're like, wow, Metcalf in the 4th and 5th round was such a good value. But Lockett in the 7th round was still the better value, even though Metcalf scored 15 more fantasy points. And that could very much be the case with Ridley and Kirk. And I know we touted Ridley on this show a few weeks ago. When we spoke about him, he was still a 4th to 3rd round pick. I've seen him go as early as the late 2nd round now. People are much higher on him. He continues to rise. And Ridley will probably pay off the price. But it's going to get to a point where Ridley pays off the price, but Kirk was still at cost gave you back more. You look at Lockett, similar size. You look at Lockett's career path. It took Lockett a couple of years, right? He was outside of it. That 4th year, he hit his stride. He never looked back. Wide receiver 23 to wide receiver 16 in PPR points per game in that range for 5 years straight. A perennial wide receiver 2, and probably falls off this year because of age. We'll see. He's a little old. But those first 3 years, he was putting it together, but he was still getting targets. He was getting air yards. He wasn't really finding the end zone. He was figuring out the game. Christian Kirk, arguably his first 3 years were better. More touchdowns, had 1,000 air yards, had 100 targets, had more targets. And then you see a guy who's playing most of the season, but not all of it, getting volume, but not necessarily capitalizing on it. If you sift through his player profiler page these 3 years, you see a lot of bits and pieces of a player to like. And he caught his stride. He figured out how to stay on the field for 17 games. And he's seeing his ceiling, and he's not going to look back. This is a wide receiver 2 now for years to come. And until he reaches the age apex, he is 26 years old. We have 3 good years of Christian Kirk being a value, and we'll probably bring him up every year on this show. So when you look at these 4 guys, you have Jaylen Waddle, who probably can just never be too expensive. Really good player. You have DeVonta Smith, who's probably at the right price, but because of how ADPs are, you have to be a little skeptical. This year will really be telling as to what this player is, but we already know he's one of the best players in football. T. Higgins is definitively a bit overpriced, but also definitively a very good player. You would love to see him cheaper. And I would be blown away if we ever saw Christian Kirk at a price point where he's not buyable, but he's certainly not as talented as the other 3 that we just named. Not a true wide receiver 1, but a very good high-end wide receiver 2, who, if healthy, will not fail.
And that's going to conclude this episode of Stat Masters. If you're on YouTube and you enjoyed this video, make sure that you give this video a like. If you're not already, please subscribe. We do this show every Monday on YouTube. And we also do this show live on Discord. You should join the Discord server. And here's why you join Discord. After we do this show, after we finish, we'll answer your questions. Got any Dynasty, any best ball questions? Chris and I will take time and answer your questions. Go to playerprofiler.com/chat to join the Discord server. And from Aaron and Chris, we will see you guys next week, and we bid you adieu.
Hey, you like that video? Be sure to subscribe and activate those alerts so you get notified as soon as new videos drop. And be sure to check out playerprofiler.com. We have all the tools for you to dominate every type of fantasy league. We have a draft kit, Dynasty Deluxe, data analysis, DFS Dominator, and don't forget the player rankings to rule them all.